Here is where we get into some of the trickier stuff. Now we're finally going to shift demand or change demand. So this is when you move the entire curve. So it's a change in quantity demanded at any given price. So something fundamentally had to change about people's desires to purchase this product or service or whatever it is that the businesses are selling. So when you hear change in demand or demand changed, that is a shift of the curve, not movement along the curve. If you hear quantity demanded changed, that is movement along the curve. If you hear price changed, that's movement along the curve. Once again, demand changing implies the curve itself has shifted. Now, what institutes an increase and what institutes a decrease? A rightward shift of demand, that is an increase. So if you're looking at the graph on your screen, if you start at D1 and you have an increase in demand, we shift to the right. Sorry for my terrible arrow, but we shift to the right. If we have a leftward shift, that's a decrease in demand. So once again, if we start at D1, we shift left, indicated by my arrow, which was slightly better until a second ago. A leftward shift in demand indicates a decrease in demand. So if you go from D1 to D3, increase. D1 to D2, that's a decrease. Now you might be thinking, but Mr. McNair, isn't D3 also a shift up? Wouldn't that make more sense in my brain to say an increase in demand goes up, increase up? You might think that, but that's not a good way to remember it, because if you keep things as left and right, it will always be consistent with increase and decrease. If you start doing up and down, you're going to get confused, because when supply shifts up, that's actually a decrease in supply. So always do it as a left or right shift, never up and down. Now for what actually shifts the demand curve. First, and one of the most likely to show up on the test, is a change in the price of related goods. These are substitutes and complements. A substitute good is just a good that you can use in place of whatever good you're modeling. So if you're modeling coffee, then a substitute good would be tea. They're both caffeinated beverages. If you're modeling flights, then trains might be a related good, because they're both modes of transportation. These are substitute goods. Pencils and pens is another very good one. The idea is you would use one in place of the other. That being said, think about it as a consumer, because consumers are what drives demand. So if you have the price of pens rise, you are more likely to purchase pencils, because they are now relatively cheaper. So the demand for pencils will increase as a result of the rise in the price of pens. The opposite is also true. If the price of pens were to fall, then it would become relatively cheaper in relation to pencils. So the demand for pencils would decrease. Complements are a different type of related good. These are two types of goods that you use together. So gas and cars, peanut butter and jelly, or if you're a fluff person, peanut butter and fluff. If you don't know what fluff is, you should really get on that train. It's delicious. But that's besides the point. Two things that you use together. So if the price rises in one, once again, think as a consumer, if the price rises in one, you're less likely to purchase the other good. So if the price of fluff increases, I'm less likely to buy peanut butter, so my demand for peanut butter decreases. The opposite is true as well. If the price of fluff fell, I'm more likely to buy peanut butter then, because I can use them together, and the combination of it has become relatively cheaper. So my demand for peanut butter has now risen. That the price of related goods is the most common way shifting demand will occur on the AP test. Changes in income, this is a lot easier to understand. But you do have to first think about what type of good it is. If it's a normal good, which is the easiest type of good, then a rise in income increases demand. If I have more money, I'm more likely to purchase more of this good. It's an easy concept to get. An inferior good, however, is probably the best way to fully understand what a normal good is about. An inferior good is the worst option. So if you were thinking about going out to dinner, most people would say they'd rather buy casual dining. But if they're worried about money at that moment, they might go for fast food because it's cheaper. Same thing for buses versus taxis. If you are worried about money, you might take the bus. So the bus is the inferior good. Also, generic versus name brand goods. If you're worried about money, you might go for the generic. So that is the inferior good. In this case, a rise in income actually decreases demand, which makes sense when you think about it. As income rises, people will buy less generic goods. They will buy less fast food. If you look at the McDonald's menu, you can usually tell how the economy is doing, because if they're trying to push nicer, as nicer as McDonald's gets, they're trying to push nicer foods. That's usually because people aren't eating there as much, so they want to make themselves look more like a normal good. If we're in hard times, if we're in the middle of a recession, then dollar menus become a bigger thing. After the recession in 2008, dollar menus were huge across all of the fast food restaurants. And that's because they knew that they could bring people in because they were worried about their money. So the decrease in income rose the demand for fast food. Changes in taste, this is probably the easiest one to understand. If there is a successful ad campaign, if there is a fad, if just generally people like things better, demand will increase. If there's a public perception that whatever the good is terrible for you, then demand will decrease. It's a very easy thing to understand. One of my favorite examples of this is Silly Bands, which I might even be dating myself at this point, because I don't know if you guys are still aware of Silly Bands, but they're basically rubber bands in the shape of different things that you would wear around your wrist. Why people thought they were cool, I don't know, but people did at one point. And demand for them was crazy high, and people would purchase them and at prices that were ridiculous. So demand shifted to the right because there was a fad for Silly Bands. Today, I don't know where you could even find Silly Bands. So demand has fallen because that fad has gone away, thankfully. Changes in expectations. So this is the least likely to show up on the AP test because it's the most confusing and the most wordy. And the AP test is trying to work away from giving you wordy problems. So if you are waiting for a sale, or you're acting on sales or something like that, or expected changes in income, that will shift demand. And it's all very apparent based on what the expectation is. So right before Black Friday, because if people are waiting for sales, demand will dip. People will wait. Demand will fall. And then once Black Friday happens, demand shifts very far to the right for a short period of time. So those changes in expectations are really sort of question specific and should be apparent. Another easy one to understand is changes in number of consumers. So if you have more people who can purchase your product, then demand shifts right, which makes sense because demand is really the horizontal addition of every individual demand curve. So my demand curve individually, added together with all of yours, plus everybody else in the world, makes up the demand curve for Silly Bands. And we all have decided we don't really want them. However, if we discovered a new population of people on Mars who were obsessed with silly bands, then all of a sudden demand would shift right for that because we have discovered a new market, a new population for silly bands. Um, by the same token, if you have a shrinking population for some reason, it does happen from time to time, then demand will shift left because you just have less people who are able to purchase.